Most of you know that we are in the middle, or actually concluding a sermon series entitled The Line. And this series, if you have been with us the last few weeks, you recognize that this series is pointing out the fact that history itself is divided by the coming of Jesus. And there's a line drawn in history where things that happened before Jesus came and things that happened after he came are identified by literally his coming into the world. And so history is shaped by that, and as history is shaped by that, one of the things that we wanted to look at is that his coming should shape our lives as well. There should be a line drawn in our lives where we look and we see how things were before the coming of Jesus into our lives, and then how things are now after he has come into our lives. If you've accepted Jesus, if you're a follower of him, if you're truly a disciple, we should see a difference prior to his coming and then after his coming. And this morning, the title of our message is The Line Between Typical and Transformed. And I don't know if you look at titles or care about titles at all. I try to make the titles mean something. And the first sermon in the series, we talked about the line between hopelessness and hope. And as Jesus came into the world, he came into a hopeless world, and he brought hope. And as he came into our lives, our perception of the world and our lives should be radically changed. And I want us to recognize that with this series today, with the sermon today, the line between typical and transformed, we're just not dealing with Jesus coming. It didn't just deal with perceptions or changing perceptions from whether the world was hopeless or was full of hope. Or last week we talked about something a little more personal. And we looked at, the line between trash and treasure. And I know people deal with self-image and self-esteem, and hopefully it's Jesus is coming, revealed to us God's true love for humanity, God's true love for us. But it's not just changing perception. It's not changing our perception of the world, not just that, not just changing our perception of ourselves. Jesus came to really bring change and transformation in a real way. Now, when I say the word transformation, I have to be honest with you. I always think of Transformers. Anyone know what the Transformers are? A few people, some people don't. Anyone in the back there? Okay, pretty much everyone knows Transformers. They're these alien beings, I grew up watching the Transformers, the cartoons. I also like the movies that Transformers, at least the earlier ones. I haven't really seen the last few, but I enjoy the Transformers. But the whole idea of the Transformers are these alien beings that came to our world, and they're robotic or something like robot entities. I don't know how to describe them. I'm not an official Transformer expert, but I always thought especially when I was little, I thought it was cool that like there could be a car driving down the road next to me, and next thing you know, it explodes up, and then it becomes like a person, right? Well, a robot, not really a person, but a robot, a giant robot. And I always thought that was cool. Especially with the Autobots. I can't remember the lead robot and the lead guy. Optimus Prime, yeah. Optimus Prime, every semi I thought was hey, that could be Optimus Prime right there. Transformers I get, because they change from a vehicle in a lot of cases into a person and back whenever they wanted to, and I always thought it was pretty cool. And transformation is pretty a neat thing. Change, and sometimes we resist change, but when we recognize that we need change is a good thing. And seeing change happen in our lives is a good thing. One of the things that you may not realize, and I don't think about it too often, is the fact that Christmas is significantly connected with transformation. I want to read to you a little bit about the typical Christmas narrative from Luke chapter 2. You probably read this with your family every year. You probably hear a message or a sermon on this every year at some point. You're all probably very familiar with it. But I want you to listen to what Luke writes as it relates to Jesus' coming. Starting with verse 1, he says, "In those days, Caesar Augustus issued a decree that a census should be taken of the entire Roman world. This was the first census that took place while Quirinius was governor of Syria, and everyone went to his own town to register. So Joseph also went up from the town of Nazareth in Galilee to Judea, to Bethlehem, the town of David, because he belonged to the house and the line of David. He went there to register with Mary, who was pledged to be married to him and was expecting a child. While they were there, the time came for the baby to be born, and she gave birth to her firstborn, a son. She wrapped him in cloths and placed him in a manger because there was no room for them in the inn. And with that passage, we gain a simple understanding of the coming of Jesus. It's pretty straightforward. There's nothing complex. You know, the narrative, the story of Jesus, how he got to Bethlehem, him being born, and the circumstances there. And we learn some basic facts about his coming. But in Philippians chapter 2, Paul is actually writing about how our attitude should be that of Christ Jesus. But he also takes the opportunity to describe the transformation that took place in Jesus' life as he came into this world. And, once again, we don't think of Philippians chapter 2 as part of a Christmas narrative of any kind, but it does shed light a little bit. Just as John's account of the Christmas story, his starting in the beginning, Paul here in Philippians offers just a little bit different perspective to kind of help us understand in a little bit more complete way what was really taking place. Because he writes this in Philippians chapter 2, verses 6 through 8, he says, and he's talking about Jesus who, being in very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be grasped, but made himself nothing, taking the very nature of a servant, being made in human likeness, being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself and became obedient to death, even death on the cross. And so, what this passage tells us is that as Jesus came into the world, he didn't come in all his heavenly glory. He didn't come in his divine power. Jesus humbled himself. He submitted himself to his Father's will. He wrapped himself in flesh and blood and became human just like us so that he could fill God's purpose for his coming. And the connection between Christmas and transformation doesn't end just with Jesus and his transformation from, his role and his place and his form in heaven, humbling himself, coming here, being transformed into human likeness. His coming also allows us to experience transformation in our lives as well. And the reason I want to focus on this line between typical and transform this morning is because I think too many people have a misconception about what it means to be a Christian. Oftentimes, just in casual conversations with people, I think people associate Christianity with believing in Jesus. And the Bible does talk a lot about, we need to believe. And that's the starting place, though. When I look at what Jesus has to say about what it means to be a Christian or what it means to be a follower of him, his answer is a little bit different than what most people hold to. And I just want to look at a couple of examples. There are multiple. I mean, everything that Jesus says really in the Gospels is about discipleship, about what it means to be a follower of his or what it means to be his disciple. Almost everything he says, and he deals with every aspect of our lives, from our hearts and our minds and our external actions and how we love people and how we interact with people. And he gives all sorts of illustrations and teachings about what it means to be his disciple. But I just pulled a couple, and they're, once again, probably pretty familiar to you. In Luke chapter 9, Jesus says these words. He says, "Whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross daily and follow me." In John chapter 8, verse 12, Jesus says this. He says, "I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will never walk in darkness, but will have the light of life." And like I said, a couple of weeks ago, we talked about how Jesus is coming into the world. He came into a hopeless situation and brought hope. And during that message, we looked at a couple of passages that dealt with, our typical state. Apart from God, before Jesus coming into our lives, our typical state and what that looked like. And we read passages like Isaiah 53:6 that said, we all like sheep have gone astray. Each of us have turned to our own way. In Ephesians chapter 5, verse 8, where Paul states that we were once in darkness. And he was referring to all of us. We were once in darkness. And so my question is this morning, how do we change from individuals who are all like sheep, who go astray, who have turned to our own way, to being people like what Jesus calls us to in Luke chapter 9, people who deny themselves, take up their cross, and follow him daily? Or how do we change from being people who walk in darkness to be people who are walking in the light? Back in Ephesians chapter 5, if we continue reading that passage, Paul continued to write about this question. Yeah, but actually, he wasn't writing about a question. He was just giving us the truth. He was just sharing the truth with us. And he says this, for you were once darkness, but now you are the light of the Lord. Live as children of the light. For the fruit of light consists of all goodness and righteousness and truth. And find out what pleases the Lord. Have nothing to do with the fruitless deeds of darkness, but rather expose them. It is shameful even to mention what the disobedient do in secret. And so kind of what I want to point out from that passage is it's not only possible for us to experience that transformation from being once being identified as being part of the darkness to being part of the light, or once having chosen to go our own way constantly, and now we're choosing to go the way of the Lord, to do his will. And not only is it possible, but in Ephesians chapter 5, Paul's like, hey, it's expected. He's like, no longer. Don't do it any longer. So once again, I ask, how can we experience such a significant transformation in our lives? Is it through our planning? Is it through our power? Is it through our energy? Is it through our effort? Is it through our self-discipline or our determination? How do we make such a significant transformation? Because the things that Jesus identified, the things that Isaiah identified, the things that Paul identified were things that dealt with all of humanity. We were once in darkness. We were once darkness. We all, like sheep, have gone astray. How can we, as individuals, experience something different, where we're no longer living in darkness, where we're no longer wandering away, following our own will? How is it that we can do that? To answer this question, I want us to focus on Romans chapter 12, and we're just going to look at two verses. Romans chapter 12, verses 1 and 2. And in these two verses, I believe Paul reveals how we can truly experience the transformation that God desires for us. And so I just want to read those two passages, and honestly, for the rest of our time today, we're just going to look at these two verses. And this is what Paul writes in Romans chapter 12, verses 1 and 2. He writes, "Therefore, I urge you, brothers, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as living sacrifices, holy and pleasing to God. This is your spiritual act of worship." He goes on to say, "Do not conform any longer to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you will be able to test and approve what God's will is, his good, pleasing, perfect will." Like I said, I want to spend our time this morning examining this passage, because within these words, I think it leads us to understand how we can experience the transformation that God desires for us to experience. He doesn't want to leave us where we are at. And I even say that in the fact that, we're all in different places. I'm not even referring to, he doesn't want to leave the world in this hopeless state. He wants us to bring us in hope. But even along our journey, as we grow in our understanding and our commitment to God, he continually wants to bring us to where we need to be. And he wants us to experience transformation in our lives. And so starting with verse 1, Paul begins writing this. He writes, "In view of God's mercy." And I just want to pause right there, because in that phrase right there, in view of God's mercy, what he's referring to, this idea of mercy, he's talking about what he had said in the preceding chapter. And in the preceding chapter, in Romans chapter 11, he was dealing with the reality that, hey, he's writing to the Christians in Rome. And these were Gentile Christians for the most part. And what he deals with in chapter 11 is the fact that, hey, it was truly an act of grace and mercy that these individuals, these Christians had the opportunity to be Christians, because Christ came first for the Jew, because they were God's chosen people. They were meant to be a holy nation. They were meant to be a people belonging to God, but they rejected God, and they rejected Jesus coming as their Messiah or Savior. And so God opened the door, and it was through them that the entire world was to be blessed. And they were through Jesus. But it was because of their rejection that God opened the opportunity for Gentiles to come to him. And the message was proclaimed to them. I mean, we see back in the book of Acts, this was, it kind of blew Peter's mind. I mean, he's waiting, he's hungry, he goes into this trance, and he sees this sheet being lowered, or something like a sheet with all kinds of animals in it, and he hears this voice, he hears God say, hey, get up, kill and eat, and he's like, hey, no way. There were unclean animals in there, and he's like, nothing unclean has ever touched my lips. I'm not going to eat anything unclean. And God's like, hey, don't call anything unclean that I've made clean. And then he goes on to say, hey, there are some people coming, and they're looking for you, and they want to take you back. And essentially, it was Peter's mission at that point to go to the house of Cornelius and proclaim the gospel to them, and the message was first preached to Gentile people through that. Peter's initial response was like, hey, no, that the gospel is meant for the Jewish people. But once again, God opened the door. And so as he's writing here in Romans chapter 12, he builds a foundation, saying, in view of God's mercy, like, you are the recipient, all people are the recipient of God's grace and God's mercy. And he wanted them to understand that the opportunity that they had to be children of God, to be sons and daughters of God, to be members of his household, to be followers of Jesus, was an act of grace and mercy. Paul continues by writing that in response to God's mercy, that they should offer their bodies as living sacrifices, holy and pleasing to God. It's very much in line with what Jesus said, deny yourself, take up your cross, and follow me. Paul said it in the terms of, hey, offer your bodies as living sacrifices, holy and pleasing to God. Be willing to deny yourself. Be willing to offer yourselves completely to God. The imagery that Paul is using here makes what he's asking of them pretty clear. A sacrifice, has no rights. It has no power. It has no privileges. It is laid upon an altar as an offering. And being a living sacrifice, what Paul is saying is, hey, live your life humbly before God. Live your life sacrificially. Recognize that who's in control. Give yourself completely to him. That's what Paul was calling his readers to do, to humbly approach God, to offer themselves completely, and to live their lives in every moment, in every situation, for his purpose and for his glory. Paul concludes verse 1 by writing that these living sacrifices, what it means to live in relationship to God. He writes, this is your spiritual act of worship. Living your life as a living sacrifice is your spiritual act of worship. And we use the word worship a lot. And I know there are a lot of great definitions, and my definition of worship, how I think of it, may not be that great. I don't know, but this is my definition of worship. I basically think of worship as this: worship is a response to someone or something with an acknowledgement or declaration of their true worth or value from that person. So, simply put, I look at watching football. I'm a sports guy. I like watching football, basketball. I look at the arenas, and I see people in the arenas, and their face is painted, and they're jumping around, they're celebrating every time something good happens for their team. That, by my definition, that is an act of worship. They're assigning value to someone or something. And they're responding to that, showing the value or worth of that team. And I think about, movie stars and music stars and how, people go crazy around them. I mean, just insane. I really don't follow the entertainment world too much, but I do remember seeing, it goes back a long way. And I was, the Beatles. How many you guys remember the Beatles? Anyone? Yeah. 2 people remember the Beatles, okay? For you 2 people that remember the Beatles, when they came to the United States, like, people would go crazy. And I've seen, like, news clips of, like little girls, like, the Beatles! And they're, like, running around, just going crazy, like, hey, celebrating the fact that if they, like, touch their hand, like, I'll never wash my hand again. And people act that way. I mean, I don't get it. I don't understand that, but people act that way around, like, famous people. You think about political rallies and whoever your political person is, like, people go in droves to these political gatherings. In my mind, what they're doing is they're showing the worth or value of that person. And I don't know what you think about, our worship service. During our worship service, how we respond to God, whether externally, internally, vocally, non-vocally, whatever our heart is, what kind of message, what kind of value are we assigning to God with how we worship? And Paul in here in Romans chapter 12 is like, hey, be a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing God. This is how you worship him. This is how you show value to him. Everything that you say, everything that you do is an opportunity to worship him. Like how you interact with your spouse or your kids, how you interact with your neighbor, how you interact with your coworkers, how you interact with the person who's serving you, after you leave church today and they had a bad day and they're not really giving good service. Everything that we think, say, or do could be an act of worship to God. Assigned value to him. Someone's having a bad day, they treat you bad. You know what? That person is loved by God. And we have an opportunity to love God through loving that person. It may not be easy. Paul's like, hey, live your life as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God, because that is how you worship him. That is how you show how valuable he is to you, that you're willing to humble yourself and do his will. Now, if you haven't been paying attention so far, this is where I want you to pay attention, because we have one more verse left, 12, verse 2, and this is where Paul really gets into specifically talking about this transformation that we should and could experience in our lives. So starting with verse 2, Paul writes, "Do not conform any longer to the pattern of this world, but be transformed." And so I don't want to talk a whole lot about this, but because I'm not really into grammar that much, but I think it's interesting that he uses the passive voice here. And passive voice, you can see that in the English Bible, but it says, be transformed. It doesn't say transform yourself. It's like be transformed. And so what that points out to us is that this transformation is something that happens in you. It's not something that happens by you. And maybe you're sitting there scratching your head like, okay, so what am I supposed to do? How does this all relate? In Ephesians chapter 5, it talks about us doing part of this process, and really we do have a part in it. Verse 1 really depicts what our part is. It's humbling ourselves before God. Opening ourselves up, recognizing his place, that we're just a living sacrifices. We are his. Everything we have, everything we are, everything that we can be is his. And we're offering ourselves to him. And when we do that, this transformation can begin to take place in our lives. In Philippians chapter 2, Paul writes more about this relationship that we're meant to have with God. In chapter 2, verses 12 and 13, he writes this. He says, "Continue to work out your salvation with fear and trembling, for it is God who works in you to will and to act according to his good purpose." Sometimes we struggle and we strive and we fight. We get frustrated and disappointed because we want to become something good. We want to be the best version of ourselves that we can, and we try to do it on our own. And so we set these things up, have these checklists, or we have this agenda we need to follow, or have these expectations that we need to meet. And we try, and we fail, and we try, and we fail, and we try, and we fail. The whole time, not realizing, the Bible tells us, to him who is able to do immeasurably more than all we ask or imagine, according to his power that is at work within us. And we know passages like the one I just quoted, and the one that is here in Philippians 2, that it's God who works in us to will and to act. And we know these passages, but I don't know if we're not patient enough to wait on God, or if we don't trust him enough to see what he does, but we try to do it all on our own, and we fail to go to him, and we experience failure, and sometimes we end up giving up. Simply because, although we believe in God, we don't allow him to work in our lives. So I want to challenge you just to consider, when we think about this passage in Romans chapter 12, verse 2, where he writes about the fact that we need to be transformed instead of transforming ourselves. That passive voice means that we have to trust in God to do his part. The next point I want to point out about this transformation that we're meant to experience, Paul continues to write this. He says, be transformed by the renewing of your mind. And I just want to point out that it's something that's progressive. It's something, it's not something that just immediately happens. Like, hey, we're new. Like, everything's, like, all our problems, all our issues, all our struggles, all of our, frustrations, all of it, that's gone because we've given ourselves to Christ. There is a moment where we turn to him and we accept him and we follow through this plan of salvation that he's given us, and we've received him, but we're not who we are meant to be at that point. And I want to go back, once again, another kind of grammatical thing here. I want to go back to the Greek word, because I think the Greek word illustrates the point I'm trying to make so good. The word for transformation is the Greek word metamorphostai. All right, it's where we get our word metamorphosis from. And if you know anything about metamorphosis, the only thing I know about it, I'm like earth science from like 8th grade, so I'm sure I'm going to get I'm not going to get into the details because I'll get it all wrong. But I do know the basics, all right? During metamorphosis, the caterpillar turning into the butterfly doesn't like sew wings for itself. It doesn't transform itself. That, it goes into this cocoon, and then somehow, God made it do this, all right? God was like, hey, it's time for you to be transformed. It's time for you to go through this metamorphosis, this change. And it goes into this cocoon, and it kind of is in there, and then whatever takes place, and then when it's time to come out, it kind of breaks out of the cocoon, and through that process, it's no longer a caterpillar now, it's a beautiful butterfly, right? Metamorphosis. Is there any 8th grade science teachers in here? They could probably explain it a little better than me. But the point I'm trying to make is that very much like that process of change and transformation, we experience that as well, where God continues to work in our life. He starts where we're at, but he continues to work and continues to shape and continues to mold us until we are the person that he wants us to be. And these three things really tie it together. The fact that, it's in passive voice, so it's something that we experience, not that we do, and it's progressive. It just continues to go. And the last one that goes along with this is that it's purposeful. He doesn't just create change in our lives because he's bored. He creates change because there's a purpose for it. And Paul gets into it there in Romans chapter 12, verse 2. He gets into part of what it is. I don't think it's all-encompassing. why we experience this transformation. But one of the reasons why is the fact that if you just read it, it says, be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you will be able to test and approve what God's will is, his good, pleasing, and perfect will. And so one of the reasons why we experience this transformation is that so we can see and understand and know what God's will is for our lives. And I was like, how does that help us do that? And during this transformation process, we are becoming more and more like Christ. Like he's reshaping our hearts and our minds and our attitudes and our priorities and our passions. And the more we become like Christ, the more we're able to understand God's will for our lives. I love the passage in 2 Corinthians chapter 3, verses 12 through 18. And Paul explains the significance of being transformed in this passage and why it's so important to become like Christ. In the beginning part of the passage, Paul addresses the great blessing we have because we live under this new covenant. All right, and so you can go back, and contextually, you might want to go back a little bit, if you're going to read this on your own, go back a little bit further, and he's dealing with, hey, in the old covenant, things were like one way, and then this new covenant, things are new now, and because of this new covenant, that we're not under law, we're under grace, and under Jesus' blood and his sacrifice, because of that, we are really blessed. And so just knowing a general idea of the context, I want to read just these few verses. Starting with verse 12 of 2 Corinthians 3, Paul writes, therefore, since we have such a hope, we are very bold. We are not like Moses, who would put a veil over his face to keep the Israelites from gazing at it while the radiance was fading away. Let me just pause right there for a second. If you're not familiar with what he's referring to, Moses would go into the presence of God, and he would literally be glowing. All right? And the Israelites would see this, and they would be terrified, like, I'm glad you're going to see God, because I don't want to be a little glow stick or whatever Moses turned into. I don't want to be that, and I don't necessarily want to see that. It terrifies me, and rightly so, because God is an amazing and terrifying being, just so powerful, so awesome. But that veil represented just separation between what God was doing and the Israelites, and they wanted that veil there. And veil also represents, we're going to get into it in a second, the veil represents that separation between God and man with the Holy of Holies and where his presence resided and where people resided. And there was a veil there as well. And so he gets into that a little bit. And so in verse 13, he's like, we are not like Moses, who would put a veil over his face to keep the Israelites from gazing at it while the radiance was fading away, but their minds were made dull, so that this day the same veil remains when the old covenant is read. He says it has not been removed because only in Christ is it taken away. Only through Christ do we have this opportunity to really be in God's presence. In verse 15 he says, even to this day when Moses is read, a veil covers their hearts. But whenever anyone turns to the Lord, the veil is taken away. Now the Lord is the Spirit, and where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is freedom. And we, who with unveiled faces all reflect the Lord's glory, we are being transformed into his likeness with ever-increasing glory, which comes from the Lord, who is the Spirit. There's a reason that God wants to see us transformed. When we talk about, I just want to know what God's will is for my life. I mean, if I just knew that, I would do certain things. I would live a certain way. I mean, he's given us his word to give us that, to the understanding, but he's also reshaping our hearts and minds. If we're offering ourselves as a living sacrifice to God, and we're allowing him to do his work in us, he's doing the work of transformation in us, making us more and more like him. And so when we see people on the streets, we begin to see them as Jesus does. When we have encounters with people in our lives, we begin to encounter them like Jesus would. And so many things that where this need to be right, or the being proud or being arrogant or whatever, all of that fades away, because as we become more like Christ, we take on his characteristics and his qualities and his passions and his desires, and submitting ourselves to the will of God like he did, and understanding that our lives aren't about us, it's about doing God's will and glorifying him. And so this morning, I'm going to invite the praise team to come back up, and we're going to close our service this morning. And I just want us to recognize that Jesus didn't come into the world just so that we could have another holiday to celebrate. He came to die and to pay a price for our sins so that we could live in a relationship with him where he is actively engaged in transforming us. He's actively engaged, taking us from where we are to where we need to be. And the whole goal is this, that as we live our lives and we're trying to honor him and we're becoming more and more like him, others would begin to see God in us. Others would be able to experience God's love through us. And ultimately, God's desire is for the world to come to know him. And we could be a part in that. We could play a part in that. I'm going to ask Len if he would come forward. If anyone has a decision to make, he'll be up front and he can receive you. And if you need prayer, I know Len would love to pray for you today. But we're going to stand and we're going to sing our closing song.